She had rehearsed the lines 100 times in the shower, under the fluorescent hum of the motel hallway, in the half-dark of the early morning when everyone else was still breathing. Say your name, say what you do, say why you want the job. Keep your voice steady. Don't cry. Autumn Hayes was carrying a 3-year-old and a small paper bag with a sandwich when she stepped into the lobby. The marble swallowed the sound of her shoes. The reception desk was a clean white slab, a single orchid leaning in its pot. People in suits passed like a current. Their eyes skimmed her the way a headline skimmed a newspaper, brief, disinterested. Ellie's hair was parted in 2 crooked pigtails, a neon heart sticker curled at the edge of her shirt where a sleeve had rubbed it raw. She had expected polite distance. She had not expected to be stopped. "Ma'am," Brenda said, voice practiced and thin, as if it had been polished for the very moment Autumn walked through the glass doors. Brenda's jacket was immaculate, her nameplate centered and bright. She had that particular kind of corporate calm that would not be moved for anything smaller than a shareholder revolt. "You can't bring children into the interview area. It's against policy." The words landed smooth and final. A few heads tilted. The receptionist's fingers kept tapping the keyboard, pretending not to watch. Autumn felt Ellie's small hand curl around her index finger. Ellie hummed a song she made up about bluebirds and apples. I had no one to leave her with," Autumn said. Her voice wasn't steady. It was the honest quiver of someone who had been tired for a long time. "My neighbor's car broke down. That doesn't change the policy," Brenda said. She folded the sentence into the kind of clause people use to keep things simple and tidy. "You'll need to reschedule, or—" Autumn's cheeks warmed. Around them, conversations dimmed like lamps being turned down. A woman at a nearby bench shifted her bag to block a better view. A man pretended to tie his shoe and readjusted his posture so he would stare at nothing at all. Ellie tugged at Autumn's sleeve and offered a crumpled sticker as if it were a currency. "Sticker," she said, and everything in Autumn's chest gave way for a breath. She crouched to kiss the top of Ellie's head, to bargain with the universe for one small mercy. Then the door swung open again, and a man stepped in from the brightness outside. He carried himself with the unhurried certainty of someone who had never had to justify his place in a room. His shoes were not the kind that clicked so much as they asserted. The suit fit like it had been tailored to every decision he had ever made. Logan Whitmore did not move like someone who wanted to be noticed. He moved like someone who was used to attention arriving to meet him. He looked once at the scene, the exchange, the child, the sudden quiet, and the corners of his mouth tightened in a way that was almost a humanizing fault. "Is there a problem?" he asked. Nobody turned the way you turned for announcement. Instead, the lobby turned like a tide. Brenda's smile stayed professional, but threaded with a new caution. She looked to him the way a captain looks to a general in the middle of a drill. The receptionist blinked and cleared her throat. Logan's presence didn't make the world softer, it only made it more honest. He moved through people like a hand through water, and made a small point of stopping in front of Autumn. "Why don't you tell me why you're here?" he asked. There was nothing theatrical about it, no need to rise to drama. It was simply an invitation. Autumn could have folded. She had every reason to be embarrassed, to drag herself out into the street and call the number scribbled on the ad and pretend she had never come. Instead, she felt the small, stubborn flare of pride she kept like a coin in her pocket. She straightened, wiped her palms on her jeans, and told him, "My name is Autumn Hayes. I applied to be an associate in learning and development," she said. Her words were stitched together with a quick confidence, the kind born of long practice. "I've been doing coursework online. I teach a community class once a week at the shelter. I can start Monday." Ellie tucked her face into Autumn's collar and mumbled something about the sticker. Logan watched her closely, like a man taking measurements. And for a breath, Autumn feared she was being judged for the ragged edges of her life, the motel key on a lanyard peeking from her bag, the worn sneakers in her bag. Instead, he did something ordinary. He leaned forward, scooped a spare chair from the stacked set by the wall, and set it down gently by their spot so that Ellie could climb in beside her mother. The small gesture momentarily erased the distance in the room. Brenda's lips formed a wordless correction. "This is highly irregular," she said, a thinness in her voice that tried to paper over the gap between rule and impulse. Logan did not answer the HR phrase with words. He simply tilted his head at Autumn and said, "Tell me what happened." What followed was not a confession, but a map. Late rent notices that had stacked like small stones, a landlord who preferred someone with a steady two-income household, a brother who worked nights and could not help this week, a neighbor with a cracked alternator. She admitted that especially lately, she had been putting in shifts at the diner until midnight and then logging into a recorded lecture on adult learning at 1:30 in the morning, because she wanted, more than anything, for Ellie to grow up with the idea that her mother kept trying. The story was small and precise and entirely hers. Logan listened with a face that had lines for caution and one experimental softness. He often kept his grief folded away like a letter, so private he burned the envelope. A sister lost a something that taught him all the wrong lessons about fairness. It had made him careful, inward, a person who supervised mercy the way he supervised budgets, calculated and scarce. Yet watching Autumn, something in him loosened. He didn't promise. He offered instead a concrete test. A trial 6-week position on the team, a temporary badge, and access to the company's emergency childcare fund for the immediate week while she found a more stable arrangement. "We'll see how it goes," he said. "Prove you can do the work. The rest will follow the work." He spoke a language Autumn had been taught, metrics, outcomes, yet the inflection carried something closer to an ally's faith. The lobby noise resumed like breath. Brandon at reception finally allowed himself to look up and offer a small smile. Brenda hovered, professional but visibly recalculating. People would talk. Stories get photographed and posted. Some of them were more cruel than necessary. Autumn accepted with both caution and something like light. She said thank you over and over until it softened into the steady syllables of someone who had been afraid to hope and was now learning the shape of it. A person with less practice at survival might have let the moment become a story of rescue. Autumn, she was not less. She made lists that night on a motel desk under a lamp with a tick in its shade. She called 3 childcare centers, arranged a campsite of options, weekdays for flexibility, a neighbor who could trade babysitting for groceries, and enrolled in the company's temporary benefits portal the next morning. She did not let her gratitude be a demand. She recognized Logan's intervention as an opening and not a gift. If anything, it sharpened the edge of her resolve. When she walked through the glass doors 6 days later with a laptop bag and a better pair of sneakers that had cost half a paycheck, and a child who clutched a stuffed fox so tight its ears drooped, she felt more like someone who belonged there on the basis of her own making. The early weeks were a montage of small victories and quiet work. She learned the cadence of the office, when teams met, how the coffee machine favored people with small, private rituals of spiced creamer. She sat in the back of a training room and watched professionals who had degrees and pedigrees listen to her ideas about micro-learning for hourly workers. She edited a slide deck into something tighter. She stayed late to translate a policy document into a script for a 5-minute video. Plain language, no jargon, no fluff. She found ways to make complex things feel smaller and therefore possible. Mr. Ruiz, the night janitor, was the first person she let her tired in the raw. He had worked the building longer than most people had been alive to watch careers begin and end. He smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old cigarette smoke, and he always had a pair of mismatched socks that showed a strip of ankle when he crouched. Autumn learned his story in pieces. 2 grown children who lived out of state, a wife in a retirement unit who liked jazz at midnight. The first night she forgot her lunch, she took her sandwich to the basement with him, and they ate by the humming boiler because he liked the warmth and she liked not smelling like cleaned floors. "You're too kind for a place with marble floors," he said once, and Autumn laughed, which made his face split into something like a grin. "You stick around," she told him. "You'll get used to it." It was in those small rooms, custodial closets, the thin fluorescent glow of a second-floor conference room, that Autumn's competence stood out. She learned that kindness was not soft, it was a strategy. It made people willing to explain things to you. It earned you time, and time was everything. Not everyone watched her with the same softness. A few coworkers made a habit of whispering near the coffee machine, casting looks that stuck in the back of her neck. Their opinion was a slow humidity, uncomfortable, persistent. One of the senior analysts, a man named Kyler, made a cutting joke about public relations theater and sipped coffee as if it were made of ice. There were other ways people expressed discomfort. Some were small, a chair not pushed back all the way, an extended deadline not assigned, and others were more pointed, like Brenda's careful note reminding teams that hiring decisions followed a chain and that she would be monitoring performance metrics. Brenda operated like a hinge in the building. She could open the door to reforms, but she also loved the safety of rules. She kept a tidy file of complaints and policies that smelled faintly of lemon and paper. For her, Autumn's hiring had been a ripple in a surface she liked flat. She had not wanted the CEO to see her deliberations sift into the open. She valued optics, the clean line of a brand that rarely admitted mess. That's not villainy, that's governance. Logan, meanwhile, watched from the higher floors in a way that made people speak of him as a myth. He came down for a weekly check-in and would linger pretending he had purpose, wandering through the same halls Autumn now knew like the cadence of a song. He would stop in at a meeting, ask one question, and leave without fanfare. He had a taste for the small, private kind of mercy. A coffee left in a kitchen for a staff member who had been late for a month, a handwritten note to a head of product about an idea he liked. He was also, in private moments, more complicated than the suit suggested. Once, in an elevator, he told Autumn, because she had once corrected a slide for clarity, and he appreciated it without knowing why, that one of the hardest things was making decisions that felt right, not just right on paper. His voice dropped then, as if he were mindful of the company's ears, and he said, "My sister used to say that fairness isn't a law. It's a shape you try to hold for a while before it slips away." Autumn had not asked about the sister. He had given the sentence and then moved on. It was the shape of his grief, a fragment offered, not explained. She had learned not to pry when a person gave a small thing of themselves. It was rude to insist on depth. Day by day, Autumn's work grew visible. She wrote onboarding modules that turned a dry policy into a set of tiny, approachable actions. She organized a volunteer rotation to help new hires find mentors. She sat in on HR meetings and spoke in calm, carefully prepared sentences about needs she had lived. Her slides had a polish that came from the practicality of someone who had been taught to economize. Less animation, more clarity. People began to cite her phrases in meetings. That was progress, the way a slow germination was progress. Not dramatic, but stubborn. There were moments that reminded her of the fragility of small victories. One morning she arrived early to find a photo posted on a staff forum, a candid image taken weeks earlier in the lobby showing her waiting with Ellie, the sticker visible, and a caption that read something about company image. It had accumulated comments, some sympathetic, most skeptical. The post was anonymous. It used the office's language of concern about optics, liability, and brand. The replies threaded with condolences and a quiet appetite for scandal. She felt it like a draft under a door, a shiver that came through policy memos and quiet murmurs. She was not the sort to startle at gossip, but this had the smell of something building. Brenda, who favored procedure over panic, requested a meeting to discuss potential perception issues. The phrasing sounded like glass clinking. Autumn pictured the time she had spent learning, the late nights, the careful edits. She called the number she had been given for emergency childcare and arranged a longer-term plan. She was being practical in a way she thought matched the room. When the meeting invitation arrived, it was polite and short. In a clear conference room under a ceiling of recessed lights, Autumn sat across from Brenda and two other HR reps while Logan's assistant placed a folder on the table like a compact offering. The folder was thin. The room felt thick. "We've had some internal feedback," Brenda began. She slid a printed page across the table, words sanitized to avoid accusation. "Given the image concerns, we'd like to discuss options. Some teams worry about client perception. We want to preserve our professional standards." Autumn had expected some of this. She had not expected the neatness of the paper when it arrived like a verdict. "We can provide support," Brenda continued, "short-term childcare, flexibility with hours. But there might also be a request for a voluntary leave or a transition pending employee and stakeholder comfort." Autumn's throat went tight. She imagined the word resignation printed in a loud typeface. She imagined the conversations she'd have to have with Ellie about why Mommy wasn't needed at the office anymore. She imagined the stacks of plans she'd made dissolving into something small and shut. She said, slowly and without theatrics, "I have been working nights to make sure I can be here. I've arranged childcare starting Monday, and I've been delivering on every metric. If you have concerns about perception, I can address them in my work. I want to earn this." Across the table, Brenda's hands rested, patient and neat. "Performance is one thing," she said, "but perception affects everything. Clients have expectations. Investors ask questions. Our role here is to protect the company's brand." It was a sentence shaped by a responsibility Autumn did not resent. She understood the rent audits of organizations. Still, she felt the blade of it. The implication that her presence could be an asset or a risk measured by something she did not control. At the end of the meeting, they left her with a note of caution and an invitation to recalibrate. The folder was a small thing with a small stack of suggested action items. "We'll follow up next week," Brenda said. There was a careful pause, a kind of preemptive kindness. When Autumn stepped back out into the lobby, the marble glinted. People walked through their lives with the same small insistences. Ellie, who had been at a neighbor's, met her at the motel door with a crumpled drawing, a sky with 3 suns. Autumn held it like a talisman. She thought about all the ways a person could be valued, by what they produced, by the steadiness of their hands, by the small graces they left behind. She was not unafraid. She was not unready. She went on doing the work. A week later, a bigger invitation arrived. There would be a meeting, Brenda said, this time with key stakeholders. Someone had started a thread on an industry forum about fair hiring practices and brand safety. The comments had been picked up by a small trade publication and quietly circulated to a few board members. The company mattered to more people than the people who worked within it. Suddenly, the story of Autumn in the lobby had become an image to be adjudicated. It was the kind of pressure that made truth a commodity. It did not necessarily mean anything untoward, only that visibility had weight. Logan, who knew how these currents moved, called Autumn into his office and closed the door. He did not offer platitudes. He offered a conversation. "I saw how you handled the training last week," he said, casting his attention to the small notebook where he had scribbled a few notes. "You made it approachable. People learned." Autumn braced and then relaxed. Praise was not alarming. Praise was an instrument of industry. She said, "I'm grateful for the chance. I work hard to make things clear." He nodded, as if he appreciated the use of the grammar. "Brenda worries about perception," he said. "We have stakeholders who are nervous." "But I don't think perception and performance always line up the way you fear. I want you to know I don't intend to let this fizzle because of a photo someone took. We brought you in for the work. He set a small folder on his desk, different from the HR one. It contained a 6-week plan, measurable outcomes, and a resource line to the emergency childcare fund he had authorized. The language was sober and businesslike. He did not make promises he couldn't keep. He framed potential outcomes around metrics and process. Autumn felt steadiness in that. She accepted the plan with a quiet gratitude that was practical and specific. "I'll meet the metrics," she said. There were eyes on both of them, of course. Offices have ceilings of attention. Even closed doors let sounds through. She saw the ripple of gossip working the same way a creek works a stone. Patient. Inevitable. That night, she went home to a motel room with cheap curtains and a playlist of lullabies she could sing without forgetting her own name. She checked her messages. A friend texted a photo of a headline that did not name her, but shaped itself around the idea of brand risk. Autumn did not pretend the worry away. She kept working. She drafted the first microlearning module that night, sent it before midnight, and edited it again in the 40 minutes before dawn. She cooked a pot of something that could be packed for the week and placed it in the cooler bag she had bought secondhand. Ellie drew suns on sticky notes and placed them over the motel's deadbolt like a constellation. The next mornings blended into one another. Autumn's work became a ledger of little proofs: improved onboarding completion rates, an internal survey that showed new hires found the materials clearer, a small drop in first-month turnover among seasonal hires who had been given an hour's mentorship from someone in learning and development. Her metrics were not romantic. They were numbers on a page. They mattered because they were things she had done. At the same time, the noise grew. Anonymous comments on forums widened into an internal mimetic trend. Someone had taken a picture during a staff outing last month where Autumn had been the only parent present, a child's hand peeking under a table as she had smoothed a napkin. The photograph traveled faster than the truth. A manager in another department wrote an internal note asking for clarity on hiring criteria. Another used the phrase consistent brand experience as if it were a prayer. Brenda's briefings became more frequent and precise. She suggested preemptive communications, a moderated Q&A for employees. She suggested an optional voluntary agreement that staffers could sign, something about alignment with company image, which sounded at once vague and heavy. Autumn felt the building pressure like the first rain before a storm. She made sure her metrics were airtight. She rehearsed the phrases she would use in the next meeting: accountability, transparency, measurable outcomes. She reminded herself of the small proofs she had already produced. She arranged for a neighbor to watch Ellie if a meeting ran long. She did everything she could to make herself uncontroversial without being invisible. That afternoon, as the sky outside the building gathered a slack of gray, she entered the conference room and sat across from Brenda, the HR reps, and one additional man she recognized only by his suit, the kind of person who is assigned as the voice of stakeholder confidence. He had a measured look, one that belonged to someone who spoke for absent people. They slid an envelope across the table. It was not an angry thing. It was a carefully folded white envelope, the kind used to contain formal language, suggestions, recommended steps, voluntary options. Its presence had the same hush as the first time she had to hand in rent late, an irreversible ceremonial note. "We want to offer an option," Brenda said, the corporate voice softening like a recorded pleasure note. "A voluntary transition that would allow you to step back. It protects the brand, it protects your dignity." Autumn's fingers closed around the edge of the chair. Some part of her recognized that this was how power had been taught to move in rooms she had not been prepared for. Gentle, calibrated, offered as a kindness when its real intent was containment. She looked at the envelope and then up at the faces around the table and felt her world reduced to the weight of that paper. Outside, the day turned like a cage. Someone had set a slow, steady rain against the window, and water threaded down the glass in quiet rivers. She could imagine Ellie drawing suns and taping them to the motel window to make the rain less lonely. She could imagine the careful work she had done dissolving into a suggestion meant to be kind. Autumn did not make a spectacle. She did not pound the table. She folded her hands on her lap, the way she had learned to do when a child was crying in the pew at the shelter. Calmness begets calmness. She reminded herself that the action she wanted, to be judged by her work, could only be won by continuing to show up. She would not let fear decide for her. She looked across the table at Brenda and at the unidentified man, and said with a steady voice she summoned from places where there had been practice, "I've been given a trial. I accepted it because I wanted to prove the work. If there are concerns, let the work speak. I will meet the goals you set. I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for a chance." For a moment, the room held its breath, and in that suspended silence, something unsteady shifted. The folder sat on Logan's desk in the hall between floors, not yet opened by those who would pass judgment. Autumn felt the floor tilt. The decision was now no longer purely administrative. It held the weight of optics, of gossip, of small human debts. She left the room with the envelope still on the table and felt the wet air on her face as she stepped into the street. The rain had turned the world into gleaming pavement. Passerby umbrellas bobbed like punctuation marks. She walked to a diner a block away and sat in a booth with a hash brown that had gone cold and a coffee that steamed between her hands. Her phone buzzed. A message from Logan. "I'm coming down." When he arrived, he did not storm in. He entered with the quiet momentum of someone who had already decided to move. He took the seat opposite hers in the small booth like it was part of a plan he had written in pencil. He did not offer grand statements. He said simply, "I saw the envelope." Autumn did not expect a rescue. She braced for a different kind of negotiation, the sort where power reasserts itself and decides for you. Instead, Logan folded his hands on the table, and there, very ordinary and very precise, he asked, "What would you need to make this work?" Not the charity, practicalities. It was a question that returned the agency to Autumn, one that acknowledged that the solution lived with her more than it did in any closed-door memo. She listed what she needed: time, childcare, a clear set of outcomes, transparency. He listened the way people listen when they have decided to act quietly instead of making a scene. He did not promise that the envelope would not be used. He promised he would not let her work be swallowed by spectacle. He said, "Show me the work. I'll show them why it matters." It was not a threat of salvation. It was a hand offered to climb with. Autumn took it as such. They walked back into the building together, the city now rinsed and sharp. Ellie waited in a neighbor's arms. Autumn felt the weight of the office rise behind her like a tide. She had a 6-week plan in her bag, a folder of slides she had sharpened until the margins made sense, and a small child's drawing of suns taped inside her notebook. She walked back into the lobby, past the orchid and the receptionist, past the quieted chatter, and up into the glass tower where decisions were often made by people who never had to explain themselves to anyone. She climbed because she had decided to. The meeting that would be called to challenge her presence had been scheduled for the following week. She had 6 weeks to prove that her smallness, her experience, her craft, her care, was not a liability, but a value. She had until then to make her work so precise it could not be dismissed as anecdote. As she rode the elevator up, she thought of Mr. Ruiz's mismatched socks, and Ellie's sticky suns, and the motel lamp with the tick in its shade. She thought of Logan's way of offering help, not as a spectacle, but as a compact with responsibility. She felt a tiredness that was both ancient and very recent. She felt a steady, stubborn hope. At the conference room door, she paused, ran a thumb over the sticker on her notebook, a small neon heart that had survived 1,000 washes, and stepped inside. The air smelled of recycled coffee and paper. The chairs were arranged in a circle, like seats for an audience. People took them with the manners of those expecting a show. "Let's begin," Brenda said. Autumn folded her hands. She had no script for what came next beyond the work itself. She had, instead, a ledger of small certainties. Late nights that sharpened slides, a child who learned to say "mama" like an anthem, a janitor who leaned in to listen. That was her case. It was not spectacle, it was proof. The envelope remained on the table like a quiet clock. Outside, rain that had ceased left the world washed and ready. She watched the faces around the table. Somewhere upstairs, Logan waited in the small office that had become his habit, watchful, deliberate. He was not an invincible knight. He had his own scars that made him cautious about sweeping gestures. He had chosen to move anyway. When the meeting began, Autumn spoke not with the heat of indignation, but with the coolness of facts. She read through her metrics, her plans, her proposed accountability framework. She answered questions the way someone who had rehearsed overnight answered them, honest, precise, unafraid. They listened with varying degrees of interest. Some had already decided whatever they would decide. Others took notes. At the end, Brenda suggested a period of observation. The envelope remained unopened. The wheels of governance had turned, slow, uncertain. On the way back to her desk, Autumn passed by the glass where the lobby showed like a stage. A child that was not Ellie trailed a parent with a red balloon. A woman in a suit adjusted a scarf. For a moment, she let herself imagine a world where the small acts of mercy were to be expected rather than news. She thought about the sun sketch in her pocket and the way it looked like a promise. She sat at her desk and opened her laptop. The world at large had not quieted. There would be anonymous commenters and trade articles and the constant churn of people forming opinions. But she had work to do. She had slides to refine, training modules to ship, people to mentor. She had a child who would sleep that night in a bed that smelled faintly of detergent and safety. When she closed her laptop that night, the sky outside the glass walls was sliced with city lights. In the stairwell, she met Logan, heading out after a day of decisions that kept him sleepless. They did not speak like a couple in a movie. They exchanged a look of two people who had chosen to stand on the same side of a particular small thing. "Tomorrow," he said, and it was both a plan and a promise. She nodded. "Tomorrow," she answered. Somewhere else, beneath the hum of the building, decisions were being written down that would come to meet them like weather. The envelope on a conference table waited like a foreshadowing. But for now, Autumn had a list of outcomes, a child's drawing tucked into her notebook, and the small, stubborn certainty that work could be its own argument. Outside, rain began to fall again, soft as practice. She thought of Ellie's tiny hand in hers and of the mornings when the sun warmed the motel's cracked linoleum. She thought of how fragile dignity could be and how fierce people became when it was at stake. She had been rejected once in a lobby. She had been seen once by a man with a guarded heart. What came next was not rescue, it was proof. And proof, she knew, was something you earned every day. If the lobby had been the first vote against her, the week that followed felt like an entire city weighing in. The anonymous threads multiplied, the hollow kind of commentary that traded complexity for certainty. A freelance writer in a trade outlet had picked up the staff forum screen grab and spun it into an editorial about brand risk and modern families. The piece didn't mention Autumn by name, but the picture did, the sticker lumping her into someone else's moral equation. Logan read the article at his kitchen counter with his coffee cooling beside him. The article fit the shape of the problem he hated most, neat arguments about reputation that ignored the work people did behind closed doors. He had seen this pattern before. Small human stories, turned into symbols, then used to argue away responsibility. He had also learned the cost of quiet avoidance. He closed the laptop with a small, decisive motion and called the meeting that would decide whether the envelope on the table became a sentence. The meeting was scheduled in the big boardroom, the one with walls of glass and a row of chairs arranged like a stadium. People who had the power to make policy sat along one side. Autumn sat opposite them, feeling like a case file and not a person, until Logan walked in and sat at the head of the table. His presence changed the scale. It didn't erase the stakes, but it shifted them from a matter of optics to a question of values. Brenda opened with her prepared notes. She spoke of risk and stakeholder confidence and maintained the corporate rhythm she had mastered. The man representing investor relations talked about churn rates and potential client discomfort. The language was measured and abstract, the kind that erases faces. Autumn listened, keeping her hands quiet on her lap, mapping the contours of the arguments like a cartographer who had learned to draw boundaries from memory. When Logan leaned forward, it was not to interrupt. He set his palms on the table and said, plainly, "We brought her in to solve a problem. We didn't hire her to be an example." There was no applause, because this was not a speech. There were only small movements, heads inclining, a notepad being scribbled. He outlined Autumn's metrics: onboarding completion rates, reduced turnover for seasonal hires, the volunteer mentor program she'd organized. He spoke of results with numbers, precise and unflinching, the language the room understood. "And yes," he continued, "we are a brand. But what we sell is trust. If we begin to turn trust into a commodity we can only trade when convenient, we will lose what makes people want to work here." He folded his fingers together in a way that looked less rhetorical than intentional. "We will not punish performance because someone somewhere took a photograph." It was a line that unbalanced the ledger. Brenda's face did not change. She was a professional and a guardian of process. She countered with the same steady voice. "Perception matters," she said. "Clients ask questions. We must anticipate reputational harm." Logan nodded. "We should anticipate it. We should not capitulate to it when doing so undermines the core work." He tapped the thin white envelope with a fingertip. "I'm not asking for exceptions without consequence. We will measure. We will set a timeline. We will document outcomes. But I will not let an administrative paper be used as a tool to erase someone who has proven their value." There were minutes of quiet measurement. People parsed his proposal the way analysts parse a spreadsheet. He proposed a monitored period with clearly defined KPIs and an internal communications plan that would frame their actions honestly rather than shape a narrative to keep cameras away. He asked for a pilot program to be proposed, an idea he did not present as charity, but as a strategic initiative that would meet both mission and market: childcare support and training that improved retention. "If this works, it's a competitive advantage," he said. When he finished, he reached for the envelope and stood. It was an unceremonious movement. He did not tear it to make a show in the boardroom. He slipped the paper into his pocket and left the room with a quietness that said the issue would be handled. He gave Autumn a look as he passed, a look that was not pity, but an acknowledgement that the fight now had a shape and a defender who would not make the defense spectacle. Outside the glass, the city breathed in rain. Autumn folded and unfurled the small sun sketch in her pocket as if testing whether it still sat warm against her skin. The immediate threat receded but did not vanish. Corporate answers have a way of being polite and later becoming something else. She kept working not because she had found peace, but because the ledger still needed more entries. Over the next weeks, the pressure hummed like an undercurrent. Anonymous chatter continued. A few colleagues, those who benefited most from maintaining the old certainties, tightened their social circles. There were stealthy emails that cited concerns about precedent. Autumn met each one with increased labor, better slide decks, clearer metrics, a careful cadence in her reporting that left fewer gaps for fiction to enter. She was not naive about optics, but she refused to let perception be the sole arbiter of value. At the same time, Logan began to move from being a distant figure to someone whose attention landed in small, meaningful ways. He showed up at one of her training sessions midweek with a travel mug and a folded sweater over his arm, not to assess, but to listen. He sat in the back until a lull, then clapped politely and left without comment. People speculated. Autumn treated his appearances like weather, something to note, but not to rely on. Their conversations grew granular rather than grand. In an after-hours hallway, he asked about a slide she'd adjusted, and she explained why the language mattered to hourly workers. He listened like someone obsessed with detail, exactly the temperament needed for a man who made decisions that could ripple into thousands of lives. She began to see that his early restraint was not indifference, but protection. He had a catalog of mistakes he kept private, and shame had taught him caution. Their exchanges were never transactional. When Autumn declined an offer of a ride after a late session because she preferred to walk with her child, he simply took the train on another line. When she missed a morning meeting because of a childcare snafu, he noticed in his notebook and later left a simple message: "Keep me posted if there are blockers." The line was managerial. The tone was human. It was the kind of attention that granted space without demanding repayment. There were small, ordinary victories. A month into her trial period, the HR dashboard showed a steady improvement in new hire completion rates. More of her micro-learning modules were being used across departments. She spearheaded a pilot mentorship, pairing new hires with mid-level staff, and collected careful feedback. The numbers were not electric. They were the slow rise of something real. Yet they were enough to shift the internal conversation. And then came the night the storm hit. It arrived without much warning, a late summer squall that turned the city into a theater of rain. Autumn's neighbor called in the evening with a voice that tried to be light and sounded brittle. The motel roof had started to leak during the downpour. The ceiling over Ellie's bed had a small drip that was now a steady trail. The line had a crack of panic she could not smooth from the other end of the phone. She left work with her laptop at her side and Ellie's weatherproof jacket slung over her shoulder. The motel smelled of wet carpet and bleach. Water collected in little silver lagoons on the stained carpet. Ellie slept with the steady breath of a child oblivious to leaks. Autumn lay awake, mopping at a slow drip that fell into a plastic bowl. A neighbor banged on the door sometime after midnight. It was Mr. Ruiz, his mop slung over his shoulder, though he had been off his shift hours earlier. "They'd sent me a text," he said, breathless and smelling faintly of lemon cleaner. "Said someone in your building needed a hand." She opened the door and found him standing there like a statue who had remembered his humanity. "I can help get you to the shelter," he offered. He had no pretense. He had only the simple authority of someone who knew where to find a spare broom and a safe corner. Before she can answer, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Logan. Something about power outages near the neighborhood, asked if she was okay, offered help if needed. She felt the old reflex: do not ask for charity, solve your problems. She typed a small, measured response: "We're okay for now, thank you." He replied with a time and 2 words: "On my way." She did not expect him to come, but come he did. He arrived not in a black SUV, but walking up the motel steps with an umbrella and a duffel that carried blankets. He looked less like a man stepping into a scene to be photographed than a neighbor who had crossed a fence to lend a ladder. The sight of him, in the thin, fluorescent light of the motel parking lot, was both absurd and utterly human. Inside, he moved like someone who had decided to act and then learned practical things quickly. He braced a ladder while a maintenance man shifted shingles. He helped move a futon to catch the trickle. He carried a sleeping Ellie wrapped in one of his company-issued travel blankets, while Autumn crouched at the leaking ceiling with a bucket. There was no fanfare, no loud speeches, no cameras, just a sequence of hands finding practical answers. At one point, the ceiling gave a soft sigh and a small cascade fell into the bowl. Ellie sneezed and blinked awake. Logan sat on the motel bed with his legs dangling over the edge, and Ellie turned toward him with that absolute trust children give to people who have been gentle. She crawled into his lap and fell asleep again with a small, sleepy sigh, her sticky neon heart pressing against his sleeve. He did not move or try to perform. He let that moment be small and real. Autumn watched them both and felt a strange, bristling gratitude that did not need translation. After the shingles were temporarily patched and a voucher arranged for a night at a friend's apartment, Logan sat with Autumn on the motel steps while they drank coffee out of paper cups. The rain had softened to a fine mist. The city lights blurred into a smear of gold. "I used to be better at breaking things down into boxes," he said. He did not preface with strategy. He merely spoke to the thinness of his own armor. "I learned to keep policy tight because I wanted to make sure decisions were defensible. It felt safer. Then something happened." He stopped and gave the word almost no breath, and it remapped everything. She had seen the fissure before, in the tilt of his jaw, the way his hands sometimes clenched, as if squeezing memory into a small, manageable shape. She did not push. "Your sister," she said quietly, the fact filling the space between them without hunting for the story. He nodded, and for a moment his face was a map of private geography. "She had a trouble that taught me to be careful," he said. "I thought being careful meant not making mistakes for other people, but sometimes being careful becomes a way to avoid responsibility." She listened while the rain cooled the air, thinking how much of a person is made from the way they choose to act in messy rooms. "I'm afraid of hoping," she said then, without the theatrical cadence of a confession, more like a note passed across a table. "Because when things feel close, they sometimes slip. I've learned to make plans small enough that disappointment doesn't hit hard." He turned his head and looked at her, really looked, with something like recognition rather than calculation. "That's why I wanted something measurable," he said. "Because I don't want to hand you a story and call it victory. I want to give you tools and then see what you build. If I do anything else, I become the thing I didn't want to be." They sat in a silence that was not empty. It was a place where two people, both carrying scar tissue, measured the contours of a possible friendship that might, in time, become something deeper. The motel light flickered. A taxi drove by, leaving a puddle in its wake. When Ellie slept, Logan rose and walked a few steps away, out of earshot. He looked at the city as if he were trying to find a particular star through the cloud. There was a quiet tenderness to his posture, an offering without demand. Autumn watched him with a mixture of caution and unexpected ease. She had been abandoned by many kinds of promises. She did not throw herself into new ones. Instead, she filed the night under a different category: small acts with big consequences. Word of the sheltering spread quietly through the staff. It became, wrongly in some accounts and accurately in others, a small mythology: the CEO who stepped into a motel after a storm. The myth did something useful. It shifted a conversation that had been leaning toward punitive outcomes to one about practical support. It also made Autumn more visible, not as a spectacle, but as someone who had weathered a storm and still brought the work in the next day. Her metrics continued to climb. The mentorship pilot showed early promise, and board members who had once whispered now asked for more information. Logan used the momentum to propose the program with a name that felt intentional: New Roots, an initiative to support parents and caregivers in their workforce transition and retention, combining emergency childcare, stipends for training, and a mentorship network. He framed it as both a public good and a strategic investment. The pitch was not starry. It was a spreadsheet full of plausible outcomes and risk assessments. It also had the quiet moral clarity of an idea that would help people like Autumn keep their jobs while doing the work they were hired for. Autumn was offered a formal role in shaping new routes. It was presented as a collaboration. She would take a leadership position on the program development team and continue her regular duties as metrics improved. The job carried a title, Director of Training and Development. But more than the title, it carried influence. She could design the modules, she could propose the pilot's measures, she could decide what support looked like at the human level. She hesitated because she did not want to be tokenized as the project's face. She wanted to lead because she believed in the work and because she had the expertise to make it stick. When the offer came, she asked for time to think and for clear assurances that her authority would be real, not symbolic. Logan respected the request. He respected process in the honest way that meant listening to concerns and then answering them with structure rather than praise. They built new routes deliberately. Autumn convened focus groups with staffers who had childcare needs, with hourly workers and middle managers, with Mr. Ruiz, and with volunteers from the shelter. She translated their needs into project charters, metrics, and budgets. She wrote training that taught managers how to assess performance without letting stereotype decide outcomes. She insisted on a transparent reporting system so that the program's effects could be measured in retention numbers, in promotion rates, and in employee satisfaction scores. When new routes launched 6 months after the envelope had been placed on the table, the room where they announced it was crowded in a way that felt different than spectacle. Mothers and fathers, janitors and analysts, operators and executives stood together under a simple banner. Ellie was there, perched on a lap, clutching a stuffed fox with ears worn down. Mr. Ruiz, with his mismatched socks, sat near the front. They all looked at Autumn differently now, not as an anomaly, but as someone whose work had produced measurable benefit. On the stage, Logan spoke not to defend, but to frame. He said the company had a responsibility that extended beyond shareholder numbers. It included the people who built the company. He introduced the program with data and with a careful humility that made the announcement feel less like a PR move and more like the next step in a long negotiation between principle and practice. The press took photographs, this time of a program launch rather than a single candid. Autumn led the first workshop with a calm she had earned. She explained the modules, the mentorship rotations, the emergency support line, and the metrics that would evaluate success. She answered questions with directness and with the lived knowledge of someone who had been in the middle of the problem herself. The applause at the end felt like a ledger closing, not a coronation. Months turned into a rhythm. New routes rolled out to other offices. The pilot data was encouraging. Retention improved in the groups that took part, managers reported better morale, and the company's internal surveys showed a real shift in perception. Other companies called to ask how they could replicate the model. Autumn traveled to present findings, speaking in boardrooms that used to be cold to her voice. She was no longer only the story in a photograph, but an architect of policy. Her promotion was not sudden. It arrived in an email and then a formal meeting. She had earned it with spreadsheets and workshops and with the patient accumulation of evidence that forces organizations to change. The title came with budget authority, staff, and a seat at the table for programmatic decisions. When Logan signed the papers, he did not make a scene. He shook her hand, then looked at her with an expression that was not paternal, but proud, in the understated way people show when they have watched another person outwork their expectations. She accepted because she believed in the work, and because she had seen possibility move through boards and into budgets. She accepted also because it would give her and Ellie a steadier timeline, one that let sunrise be a real thing rather than a plan shouted over a late-night interface. Her acceptance did not change the fact that bills still arrived and options still had to be chosen. It simply shifted the horizon. Love, when it appeared, did so as a gradual thing, like seasons rather than storm events. There was no grand proposal under a marquee. There were weeks and months of quiet gestures. A sweater left at her desk on a cool morning, a note beside a consoling cup of coffee after a tough review, Logan showing up with a small, practical present for Ellie, a book of illustrated animals that they read together before bed. They began to trade vulnerabilities in tiny, steady ways. He told her about the guilt he'd carried for years over his sister, about the times he'd chosen policy over people and regretted it. She told him about late-night courses and the way the motel lamp's tick had become the rhythm of many small economies she had navigated. There were rules they both kept: no pressure, no transactional bargains. If anything, their closeness grew out of shared labor. Late nights editing slides, the two of them drafting program memos, Logan offering introductions for vendors, and Autumn vetting them with a candid scrutiny. People noticed, of course, offices notice, but what she and he built was not a romance that required proof. It was a friendship with an architecture that could, in time, become family. The turning point toward private life came quietly. Logan, who had been careful with displays of emotion, once walked Autumn and Ellie to a park near her new apartment. Ellie ran ahead, chased by a dog and laughing with the kind of abandon only small children carry. Logan watched her and then reached into his coat and drew out a tiny plastic crown, one of those cheap things from a party store. He pressed it into Ellie's hand like a small coronation. "For the Queen of the Suns," he said. Autumn watched them together and felt a softness that had nothing to do with payoff. She felt gratitude for a man who had chosen responsibility and a corporation that had begun to align more with its people. She felt, too, the slow uncoiling of something that might, one day, bear a different name. Time did not erase their scars. There were still days when the office hummed with friction. An anonymous op-ed, a misinterpreted memo, a manager who feared change. But the structures they had built kept friction from becoming catastrophe. New Roots had its first round of promotions from within the program, proving that support translated into career momentum. When Logan proposed a private way to celebrate the program's first anniversary, he did it with the same restrained detail he used at work. He suggested a small gathering at a courthouse garden, an informal ceremony with a few friends, Mr. Ruiz, some of the mothers who had been part of the pilot, and a couple of colleagues who had become allies. He did not call it a wedding at first. He called it a way to mark new beginnings. Autumn said yes to the gathering because she wanted to honor the community that had held her. She wanted Ellie to see a circle of people who had been steady. She also wanted a ceremony that was true to how things had felt for them: simple, honest, and rooted. On the day the sun cut through the city like an honest promise, they stood under an arch made of simple flowers. There were no cameras, no flashbulbs, only the clapping of people who had watched a lot of ordinary work turn into something better. Mr. Ruiz cried quietly and wiped his eyes on his sleeve. Ellie wore her crown, now a proper headband, and scowled at anyone who tried to move her fox. Logan did not make an extravagant speech. He said plainly, "We began by trying to do the right work. We'll keep trying. I promise to do better at that tomorrow than I did today." It was small, and it was everything. Autumn spoke of obligation and gratitude, and of the people who had taught her to measure victory in ordinary ways. They exchanged rings that were simple bands. They promised in quiet phrases that felt less like vows and more like contracts of kindness. After the gathering, they moved into a life that felt domestic and unshowy. They rotated mornings, took turns making pancakes — Ellie insisted on adding too much syrup — went to evening workshops where Autumn would speak. Logan, who had once found emotional risk intolerable, learned to sit in the front row and clap with the rest of them. They hosted company volunteers for New Roots, inviting participants to share their stories in a room that had once been the site of a harsh judgment. When Logan announced to the leadership team that he would allocate a portion of his bonus to seed a trust for New Roots, a governance vehicle meant to secure its funding beyond market fluctuations, people noticed. He did not frame it as a gift to Autumn. He called it a strategic reinvestment. The move made the program less dependent on quarterly moods and more anchored in long-term planning. It was a practical act of stewardship rather than a spectacle of generosity, and it made the work sustainable in a way that flattery never could. Years later, as new routes expanded into other cities, Autumn's name became attached to an initiative that had saved careers and transformed lives. She still remembered the sticker on Ellie's shirt, the motel lamp with its tick, the way Mr. Ruiz ate sandwiches by the boiler. Those motifs resurfaced in speeches and in small anecdotes she told when she addressed groups. She told the tale of the lobby not as a wound, but as a lesson about being seen. And being seen was not a one-time act, but a continuous practice. Logan's intervention in the lobby had been catalytic. It had shifted the arc of events, but it had not completed the story. The long work belonged to Autumn and to the people she had rallied, to the policies they had built, and to a CEO who learned to balance optics with courage. Their family did not become a tableau of perfection. There were arguments about money and miscommunications about schedules, and nights when Ellie woke up terrified from a dream about rain. But those nights were different because a network existed. Neighbors who had become friends, a program that could help, a company that recognized its duty. The final image was modest and true. A Saturday morning in the park. Ellie chased pigeons with a vigor that belonged only to children. Autumn held a paper cup of coffee and watched her daughter run until her legs were sore. Logan sat on a bench with his phone closed, his coat across his knees. Mr. Ruiz passed by with a mop over his shoulder and tipped his head in greeting. A banner in the background announced the local New Roots Community Fair, with tables where mothers and fathers were signing up for workshops and where mentors offered advice to new hires. Autumn walked to Logan and took his hand. There was no fanfare in the way they moved together, just the quiet geometry of two people who had learned to build a life that matched the work they believed in. Ellie skipped back, hands sticky with juice, and flopped into Autumn's arms with a grin so wide it made the world less complicated. Out beyond the park, the city rose and fell like a ledger of choices. Small acts, hard data, softened policy. In the end, what had started as a tense confrontation in a marble lobby became an argument for dignity, enacted in programs and daily rhythms. Leaders who were willing to translate empathy into systems created change that lasted longer than any headline. If this,